everyone, and welcome. Thanks for joining today's webinar, Cyber Risk Assessments, What Businesses Need to Know. We're really glad you could join us today. My name is Rachel Clendaniel, Marketing Coordinator here at Kite Technology. Joining us today are Jason Gobbel, Chief Solutions Officer here at Kite Technology Group. And with us also is Ryan Smith from RLS Consulting. They'll be sharing their insights on cyber risk assessments, their value, and what's involved in the process. This is such a timely topic, and we've got a fantastic session lined up for you today. We'll be saving some time at the end for your questions, so feel free to drop those in the Q&A panel throughout the presentation. And with that, I'll hand this over to Jason to get us started and to introduce himself and Ryan.
Thank you, Rachel. Hi, I'm Jason Gobbel, Chief Solutions Officer and one of the partners here at Kite Technology Group. I have a background in cybersecurity. I also happen to be a licensed property and casualty non-working agent out here in Arizona. I do a lot of talking on the sales side and helping agencies really understand things like this. For this particular webinar, I brought along a good friend and co-presenter, Ryan Smith. I've presented on various topics in various states all across this great country with Ryan. Ryan, why don't you introduce yourself and give us a little bit about what RLS Consulting is and what RLS stands for.
Yeah, so it's actually my initials. I'm Ryan L. Smith, president of RLS Consulting. I've been working in cybersecurity, especially with agencies over the last 7+ years now. Prior to that, I used to work with Vertafore, so it's been about 13 years working with independent insurance agencies across some form of technology, but really specializing in technology in the last several years. I recently branched out on my own about 1.5 years ago to start RLS Consulting. So today, still helping agencies address cybersecurity challenges. But with a lot of the stuff that I do, I also end up working with their producers to help them talk about cyber risk without making it overly technical and help make it more of a business case. And I have a lot of different programs around that. So if you're ever looking for any kind of help around cybersecurity, data security compliance, or even just talking about cyber risk, those are things that I can help with.
Very nice. So over at Kite Tech, we tend to focus on fundamentally two things: managed IT services, all the care and feeding of independent insurance agencies from the tech stack all the way down to the help desk. We also do a lot with agency consulting, primarily on the Epic side. We do accounting services, we do employee training, we do pre and post-move migrations and support. We've been doing that for a very long time.
Yeah, and at RLS, as I mentioned, we're helping more specifically around the cybersecurity side of things. And part of that includes what we have through resources through securemyagency.com, which is one of my programs. A lot of content around what you need to know as an agency as you go down this path. So really, no matter where you're at, whether you're just starting or if you've been working on this and you want to take it a little bit further, we have all kinds of resources and information that can help you, including all different types of consulting to really fit your needs. And then sellmorecyber.com is where you can learn more about the things that we do to help producers on that front. So there's a lot of different content there. And toward the end here, you'll also see securemystaff.com, something newer that I recently released, where we're doing more insurance-specific security awareness training and phishing email simulations. And we're keeping it very affordable for smaller offices out there. So that's something you want to check out later, too.
Very nice. So we've got a pretty action-packed agenda here today. We're going to start with the existential question that we always do. Why are we here and why are we talking about this? And we're going to go into what a risk assessment is, and equally important, what it is not. How an assessment is going to benefit your business, what's involved, what does this thing look like, care and considerations that you need to be thinking about along the way. When you raise your hand for help, where does that help come from? Next steps. If you've been in a webinar with me, there's always some homework. Sorry. And then we're going to get some Q&A. We have the Q&A open in the Zoom meeting. So if you're thinking about things along the way, go ahead and slide your questions in there. There is no time better than the present to get them in. If we can slide them in along the way and answer them, we'll do that. Otherwise, we'll save them for the end. So let's start with why we are here and why we are talking about these things today. Well, 4 main reasons. It's required. All the regulatory compliance says You have to do these things, and your cybersecurity practice has to be based off of a risk assessment. It's expected. Um, our clients and your clients, they just expect that we're good stewards of the data and the confidential information they share with us. And it's necessary because you can't be secure if you don't know what you're missing. But even so, many businesses are still not doing risk assessments. Many agencies are still not doing risk assessments. And that's why this is such a relevant topic and why we keep beating the drum. Brian and I have been presenting on this together for a couple of years now, just on this one particular topic. And we've learned that there are kind of two personas. So we're going to try and fill the room today with a bit of an organic conversation. I'm going to wear the hat of persona one, the IT guy, the guy who does the work. I got to figure out how I can tell Bob he can no longer do the things he used to do. I got to tell Sally why she can't do her shopping on her lunch break. You know, these are the nuts and the bolts and the real things that the IT guy has to struggle with as they get buy-in from the rank and file and put these things together.
And I'm taking more of the second persona here with more of the business side of things. Why, as a business, is it good to do a risk assessment? What kind of information do you get out of that? How does that help your planning and your ability to make decisions about how you spend your time, energy, and budget, and really understand, when you're asked to do certain things from IT, why they might be asking for these things. And it helps give a little bit more context to maybe some of the bigger picture around things that IT are working on.
All right. So, what is a risk assessment? Let's start there.
So at a high level, a risk assessment is really important to understanding the overall risk within your organization. And we're going to dive into this a little bit more in depth, but really there are a couple key factors you want to measure here. Two important ones are the likelihood related to your risk and the impact related to it. So the likelihood are the things that are the threats and vulnerabilities or weaknesses that really attribute to your probability of an attack happening. So it helps you understand a little bit more of maybe how that attack might happen. On the impact side of things, it's helping us understand, based on the technology we use, the processes we have, or just the overall part of our business as we exist, what kind of things could go wrong. Do we have sensitive information that could get out? Do we have information that we need to rely on and trust that if somebody's manipulated it, like a bank account number, now we're going to have a problem? Or just the fact that you rely on technology in the first place. So what's going to happen if the technology you're depending on is not there when you need it? So these all give us a way to begin to start to understand across our environment all of the different factors there. And when you do a risk assessment, one of the key factors here is starting to score those. So based on likelihood and impact related to the different areas you're looking at, what is attributing to this and what's making some things more of a critical risk versus a high, medium, or low? And then with that understanding, now you can start to make decisions about where you can make the most impact as you begin mitigating those. So it's going to help you have that deeper perspective. One of the things we wanted to share here, this is from a cybersecurity framework, NIST 853. It goes deep into what a risk assessment is. And if you want something to help you go to sleep at night after this, and you want to learn more about this stuff, it would be a good piece to read. But one of the things I wanted to introduce here that comes from NIST is this tier of risks, the strategic and tactical risk pyramid. And a lot of people are really good at this bottom tier, understanding the information systems and the risk related to them. But there are the other two tiers that have to do with your mission and business processes and then your overall organization. And I'm going to oversimplify it for today's conversation. But as an organization, you could think of yourself as, let's say, I'm a 10-person insurance agency here in Colorado, where I'm located. What does that mean? What are the things that are attributing to the likelihood of me being attacked? Are people aware of this type of business being something that would be a target? Could I be a victim of opportunistic attacks because of that? Am I big enough maybe to where I do have a bit of a target on my back? And then based on the type of business I have, what are those factors that attribute to the impact? Do I touch sensitive information, financial information? Do I rely on technology? So as an organization, what does my risk look like? Diving deeper into tier 2 is more around the processes. So you can think more of operations. When I think about a particular operation in my business, what are the risks associated with that? So think of servicing accounts or a claim. You probably have a person contacting you that you need to validate the appropriate party to share information with. If something goes wrong in that process and somebody's able to jump into it as a malicious actor, could they intercept sensitive information? Could they mess up information to where money moves to the wrong place? Or is there a financial transaction at all in this process? And then what technology is involved in that as we go through that overall process? What kind of things could happen if that's not there to our business because of it? And then diving into the third tier, again, where people are really probably a lot more focused, is system by system. What kinds of technology do we have and what's in there? So you look at your agency management system. What are the factors that attribute to the weaknesses there? On the provider's side, how are we making sure that they're protecting that end of the data? How are we making sure that we're protecting our access to that information in the system? What kinds of stuff is in there? Do we have private information? Do we have financials? Do we rely on information that's in there to make sure, do we have a validation to make sure that we're sending information to the right place, money to the right place, or sharing it with the right people? And then last, with this management system, we're thinking of how dependent are we on it? What if it's down for several weeks? What's that going to do for our business? So it can help us understand this at a little bit more of a level and, a deeper level, excuse me. But when you look at this pyramid, it doesn't necessarily matter if you start from the top and work your way down or bottom and work your way up. You do want to think about these different tiers and think about your risk as they kind of persist through the different levels of your organization.
And you got to kind of hit them all, right? Because tier 3 is where your traditional IT companies exist, and tier 1 is squarely within your organization. So somewhere in that tier 2, we've got to meet in the middle. So you as the organization bring some things to the table. The IT provider is going to bring some things in the table, and together we find kind of a happy medium.
This might be something that matures with you too. If you're just at tier 3 right now, that's okay. You're doing something that's really good. As you continue to do more and more, now you can start to dig into these deeper tiers too. So don't necessarily feel like you're not doing anything right if you're not hitting all those levels, but it's something to strive towards.
So you said you were going to oversimplify it. Hold my beer. So in simple terms, think about it in terms of getting punched in the nose. Are we immune to being punched in the nose? No, somebody could punch us in the nose. Okay. What? Who? Where could the punch come from when it hits our nose? How bad's it going to hurt when we get punched? And can we do anything to avoid being punched? Can we duck? Can we cover? Can we run away? That's essentially what a risk assessment tries to solve, is where the threats are coming from, how big and bad and how ugly can they be and can they get, and is there anything we can do other than just cry?
I think one of the things that people might miss there too is that you have to consider the fact that you probably are going to get punched at some point. And so you need to have those kind of questions. And I think that's where a lot of people get surprised by attacks, is because they haven't thought about, what actually could happen there. So you don't want to be caught by surprise by those.
That's a true statement. You can get punched even when the target was the guy next to you. If you've ever been in a bar at 2:00 in the morning, that's a possibility. So we know what a risk assessment is. What is not a risk assessment? And I think that's an equally important point. These things are very, very important aspects of your cybersecurity program, but they don't take the place of a good risk assessment. Things like quick scans, shallow assessments, surface scans. Insurance carriers like Coalition do an external scan, and they'll tell you some things and they'll make some recommendations. Gap assessments, vulnerability scans, penetration tests. None of those things are risk assessments, because they're not quantifying and qualifying the risk. They're not making it personal to you. They're kind of general. If you've got an exposure, it's the same exposure on a firewall that everybody's got because it's a 0-day. And if you're using that fire, it's not anything to do with your choices. So that's really the fundamental part of the risk assessment that we need to keep in mind. If we're not rating things on a scale of 1 to 10, if we're not determining likelihood of things, we're not really doing a risk assessment. We might be doing good work, but it's not taking the place of a good risk assessment.
And I'd add that some of these things, they can help enhance your risk assessment and give you more information. But I think one thing that's really important, especially with agencies out there, because you've seen things like Jason mentioned, Coalition Scan, which I think has a lot of great value in there. But some of these scans get called a cybersecurity risk assessment. There is actually a very specific term. When I showed you that pyramid, that came from NIST. That's a recognized framework that cybersecurity experts look at. That defines what we're talking about when we say what a risk assessment is. Some of these other things that get coined with that phrase, it's not really quite what it is. Some of these where basically you're providing an email address or a website and it's looking at your web server and your email host, it doesn't really tell you a whole lot about what's going on behind the scenes. If you think about what's in there, it doesn't assess whether you have simple things like training or MFA or a backup process or a strong EDR solution like antivirus. It's not really giving you that deeper understanding. I consider it similar to buying a car online, where maybe you've seen some pictures and things, but you haven't opened up the hood, started the engine, or kicked the tires. And so it's a good surface level understanding of some of the things that are going on, but a lot of times some of the findings might have anything to do with that business's control. A lot of people outsource their web host. So if you find errors in the web server, that's probably nothing that they have any control over to begin with. And so I think it's important to understand that those things provide some important information, but they're not a risk assessment. And I'll also add the vulnerability scan and pen test. Those are very important to be doing. We'll talk about where they fall into place a little bit later. A vulnerability scan can tell you where weaknesses are in a piece of technology. A penetration test explores those by saying, okay, well, what would happen if we attack that? What if we exploit this? What could happen? What would be the impacts? So they're very important parts of this, and they can really enhance what you're doing. But it's not enough alone to understand, again, some of those processes or some of the things outside the technology that attribute to our risks.
And that's an interesting point. You mentioned the web hosting. Almost all of us host our website somewhere else. And when I sit down with agencies and we first start talking about unpacking some security things, almost everybody's had a scan of some kind. And that's the scan that they share with me. And it's a web host that hosts some web pages. It's not where any of the data lives. It's not even where the email lives. So that's a pretty common misconception there, is people think they've had a scan and it wasn't even pointed in their direction. Not to say that your website is not important and you should keep that secure. You absolutely should, but none of the real meat and the potatoes of the confidential data lives there. It lives in that direction. So let's talk about how a risk assessment will benefit your business. And Ryan, this is where you get to put on that hat and talk about from an executive level. These things are expensive. Convince me it's worth writing the check.
Well, first of all, I'll say they're getting more affordable, especially with technology that can help some of this stuff. So I would double check and make sure you understand the cost related to it. It might not be expensive. It's a really good investment because a lot of what's going to happen is it's going to help you understand a lot more of the overarching plan. And so it's really hard to really account for the things that you're doing in your cybersecurity practices if you don't understand where you're at on the map right now. And so I always equivalate that to really that kind of GPS for you, as far as saying, we're here, we want to get here, but what are the decisions we need to make to get there? The risk assessment is going to give you that ability to really have, first of all, a thorough way to understand everything that's going on in your environment and be able to pinpoint these items. Again, because you're scoring them, you're able to say where your highest risks are and what's attributing to them. And because you're being so thorough, now you're uncovering information that you might not have found. I've had people I've worked with before who found that they had a server in a closet that was still connected to the internet, but they forgot about. And so it wasn't getting updates, it wasn't getting taken care of. But as they were going through this and becoming more accountable with what's out there, they were able to find these things and address them. So these glaring risks could be there that you might be missing if all you're doing is just looking at best practices that you're trying to implement. So this helps you really understand where you're at. The other side of this too is, I think from a marketing perspective, you can start to say more to your clients about how you're taking your risks seriously, these extra efforts that you're putting in place to really make sure that their data is protected. There's a lot of agencies who aren't doing this right now. And so I think that's something that can really stand out, especially as consumers are more and more aware of these kinds of attacks. They don't want to give their data to somebody that's being loose with the data. So they want to make sure that they're trusting those partnerships now. The other side of this too is you're required in a lot of cases to do these. Some of the laws, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in a moment, but some of the laws might say that you actually have to do a full-on risk assessment. Others might more generally say that you need to take a risk-based approach to protecting non-public information, or that you need to adopt cybersecurity practices based on the likelihood and impact related to your risks. Those general words are describing starting with an understanding of risk. And a lot of these laws will go back to the point of doing it well and making sure that you really understood those things when you made those decisions about what you're doing. Where I see this really helping people, though, is now they know what could happen. They can account for all these different situations. They're not going to be quite as surprised if they do have an incident, so they're able to jump onto things faster. They're able to understand what could happen under a particular attack to where they can minimize that impact as best as possible. For example, maybe they want to consolidate who has access to different types of data. So maybe some agencies trust a lot of their employees and they give them full access to everything. Well, one of those trusted people could become compromised. And now, if your receptionist has access to data they don't actually need to do for their job, well, you have an extra exposure. So when you start to look at access privileges and things like that, you can start to dial this in a little bit deeper. I think where it also helps a lot too, and this is to advocate for the IT side of things a bit, you might have had things that IT's been asking you to do, like retire old servers or move different types of technology out of the business or update laptops and technology. Well, now you're going to have a better understanding of why they're asking for those things and be able to prioritize that across other priorities that you have. And so this risk assessment's a very good place to make sure that when you do make those decisions about what you do to implement best practices, you really nail it the best possible way.
And that priority is huge for me as somebody who has a tendency to get like deep in the weeds and feel the need to understand all of the things before I start progressing. That paralysis analysis or analysis paralysis is real. So I like the risk assessment because it makes it very clear. You go through the impact, you go through the likelihood, and the roadmap is there for you. The priority writes itself, and then you can just put your head down and get to work and really do some good things.
And you can also justify your decisions a little bit better now too. This shows that you've done your due diligence. Maybe you've had to accept risks, and we have to as a business. We can't
Sure.
communicate with people outside of our company without accepting some risk. We can't move money or trust technology partners to integrate with us without taking some risk. But if we've shown we've understood that and we've done what we can to mitigate those things, now we can understand what risks we're accepting and what we're doing to make it allowed. And this gives us that ability to kind of build a case for us. And then it also might identify certain risks we need to remove. So things that, again, maybe that person that doesn't need access to certain data, we can get rid of that. So it's going to help you really be able to justify a lot more of the decisions that you have made too, if you ever have to prove that you were a victim and not just negligent when you had an attack.
Yeah, absolutely. So now that we've talked about what it is and what it looks like, let's talk about what's involved in a risk assessment. Dramatic pause for effect. You are involved. I say that kind of tongue in cheek, but it's interesting how risk assessments have evolved over the years and how specifically IT providers have kind of evolved their role. We're just so used to owning the IT and just going into reaction mode, and somebody raises a ticket or they need some help, and we just put our capes on and we just jump in and fight fires and things like that. So when New York and NAIC model law, when they were putting together their things, we were all kind of in scramble mode. Oh, what do we do? How do we do this? Okay, let's get to work. And we kind of overstepped our bounds a little bit in terms of, and we saw this when New York reiterated and retuned their regulation. We kind of overstepped our bounds in the sense that we were doing all the things, and then we would come to the executives and the business owners and say, okay, here's where we're at and here's what we need to do. And so New York kind of screamed time out and said, no, 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 no. Executives, business owners, you need to understand this stuff. You have to have skin in the game. And a lot of the regulatory words that they're using really try and drive that point home. At the end of the day, when the state of New York has questions, they don't call me, they call you. I can help, but you need to be prepared with understanding, with documentation, and with a trusted advisor for sure. So we've kind of gone through the process of iterating our risk assessments to really put them back in front and center. And it does mean that there's a time commitment on both sides of the fence. But we're in a better place involving businesses now than I think as an industry we were 3 or 4 years ago, for sure.
And I think the other side of this too, if you think back about that risk pyramid we were showing, the IT is going to understand the information technology and the systems that you have there. When you get into the processes, that might be things that are beyond IT. So maybe someone understands you're using an agency management system, but they might not know all the processes and the data and information that happens within that. And so it's really important, even if you're doing an internal risk assessment with your own team, to have the right stakeholders involved. But especially if you've used a third party here, they're going to need you to help them understand your use of this technology, what technology you have. Now they're probably using their expertise to help assess it and score the likelihood and impact based on what you told them, but there's a lot of work in getting that information to somebody. So it's just like with doing your taxes. There's a certain component that you're still responsible even if you have that outside tax accountant help you. And I'll also add to this point too, Jason mentioned New York. If you look at some of these different insurance data security laws, they do start to identify how delegation of these responsibilities gets handled. So if you're a leader of your company and you've offset this to push the liability over to a third party or to another employee below you, you're still responsible to make sure that they report back to you on their progress and that you're taking responsibility for what's being done with that information. So I think what we're seeing is more of a response to leadership trying to pass this off to saying, well, no, you're captain of the ship here. You're making these decisions. You need to make sure that you're responsible for the decisions that are made or lack thereof.
Yeah, and that solves a lot of the problems where you get into that middle layer of the pyramid where IT's identified some things and now we have to change business processes. 10 years of email in your mailbox, that's a huge risk. We got to fix it. But now we're impacting people's day-to-day jobs and where they go to search for their data and stuff like that. So that's a good example of that middle ground of where everybody's involved. I'm advocating for the data, I'm advocating for a process. We still got to get work done. How do we fit through that? So there are some granular specifics that are involved in a risk assessment. So as you start to unpack this stuff, um, there are some things you can do ahead of time to understand some things. One of the major aspects of a risk assessment is identification of assets. These are the hardware, the laptops, the computers, the cell phones that you don't own but have access to the data, the software that's installed on them. You can start by just throwing things into an Excel spreadsheet if you don't have one. That's a really good start. Make it pretty later. Threat identification, internal, external. This is where those surface scans and things come into play. Going a little deeper, you get into those vulnerability analysis, vulnerability scans and reports. Again, part of a good risk assessment. Um, Risk evaluation, that's kind of the icing on everything. I mean, it makes the cake, that likelihood, that impact. That's the real meat of the conversation. Conversations about what to do about it. Now we've learned a lot of things. Some things we're pleased with, some things we're not. How do we fix those things? Documentation is a huge part of a risk assessment because this is a rinse and repeat situation. Anytime there's a significant change in the business, at least once a year, we're going to be cracking this thing back open and we're going to be looking at the things that we said were important last year. Are they still important? Did we meet the mark? Did we do the things we said we were going to do? What does all that look like? Executive summaries, reports, reports that go up, reports that go down, the reports that go out to the staff, so that we really have an all hands on deck thing here where everybody has a part to play while we steer the ship. All of that is what's involved in a risk assessment. So, things you need to consider when you're doing this, while you're unpacking it. Let's start with this question, and Ryan, I'll ask you, what does good look like? How do we know that we're doing a good job? How do we know that we've hired an expert and they're doing a good job? What does good look like?
And it just kind of goes back to a bit of that last list that you had of some of the things that we described are important to have happen. If you're not doing those, that's a pretty good sign that you're not doing a very thorough job. So I think thorough and being really precise in what you're doing and making sure that you're really kind of kicking all the rocks, making sure that you're understanding exactly what's going on in your business. Part of it also is making sure that you have consistency in how you're scoring things like likelihood and impact. It's important to have that consistency because again, you're trying to compare different areas of your environment to different to others. So you want to be able to say these are our highest areas of risk or most critical, and you can't really do that if you haven't scored that appropriately. The other side of it too is it comes back to the ability to communicate what you've done out of there. So, for example, with the executive summary, if you've gone through all of this and now you've done a report, but you haven't been able to articulate it to other stakeholders of what this actually means, well, then you have a problem. So, making sure that it's very clear to other people in the business what you found and what things need to be done to address these risks and ability to prioritize those, that's going to be a really big part of it. So I'd say, some of the most important things are, again, being thorough, making sure that you have consistency, and then clarity at the end of it all.
So
As far as
there's an intersection here of what you should do and what you have to do. And some things you should do because it's the right thing, but there are other things like New York that will, maybe they'll just flat out tell you what good looks like, and um, that becomes your starting point in some of these things.
and
So
we've
yeah,
seen
go
some,
ahead.
for example, if you have a small agency who's using all cloud-based technology. Um, you have your management system in the cloud, you're using Microsoft. You don't have a whole lot of data in your office. You've gotten rid of paper files. You might be really lean. You still have to assess the third parties you've trusted because, again, you're responsible for that due diligence. You were given your client's data, they trust you with it. They don't really know who some of these system providers are. So if they had a breach, they're going to be mad at you, not the person that you chose to put their data into. So we need to think about the third parties there. And then when you have those cloud systems, you have access to one end of it as well too. So you have the provider side, but you also have your side of it. So you still have to take responsibility for how you're protecting access and the different technology that you're using to access it. So you might have a leaner assessment because now you don't have a huge list of things that you're using and it's pretty consolidated. And maybe you don't have to go quite as in depth if you don't have some of these requirements, but you still have to be able to show that whatever you did was thorough enough to give you the ability to make the decisions that you chose to make as you implemented best practices. So that way, if you did have an attack, you can show, first of all, clients that you did your best to protect things, but also if there's any kind of legal repercussions for it. And keep in mind, all 50 states have breach notification laws. So there's probably going to be some action you have to take if you had an attack to explain what you were doing and where you came up with that idea. So if you're not under a specific requirement that says do a risk assessment, and again, it's more of that general kind of thing that says take a risk-based approach to doing this, you're going to want to make sure that you can fall back on something that you can point to say that you didn't reinvent the wheel, that you followed a process. So I think there's a little bit of leniency if you're in that smaller area where there's not a legal requirement spelling it out, but I would still take a lot of caution with it.
Yeah, vendor management is a good example to use, I think, when we're talking about how complex it has to be, how nuanced, how specific. Most regulations speak to at some level to say that if you're entrusting a third party with some access to your technology, you have to know how they're caring for your data. And and there are vendor management systems that are custom built to pull these things off. Security scorecard is an example. Um, they're they're not cheap. In some cases, they're not easy to use. A lot of bank-owned agencies have kind of landed on these by default because they kind of grew up in the financial services world, and so you can really go off the deep end buying really expensive tools and developing really dotting i's and crossing t's processes to manage all seven of your vendors. But as a smaller agency, you could also say, I'm going to ask every vendor I have these very 10 specific questions and ask them to provide me these two or three very specific attestations, and I'm just going to keep them in a manila folder. I'm going to keep them on a shared drive or something like that. I I think that's a perfectly appropriate approach to vendor management that doesn't cost a whole lot of money, but still gets the job done in a way that's affordable, that's meaningful, that's actionable, and really shows due diligence and good care of managing that third party risk.
Now, with the third party risk piece, I would kind of consider the same ideas as you would for your own systems and technology, the likelihood and impact. So if you have a vendor where they have a high impact because there's a lot of sensitive information in there. There's financials, there's client data, whatever it might be. Maybe there's a high risk of integrity of that information. If somebody got into it, they could do a lot of damage by manipulating information there. Or you're just so dependent on it that you need to make sure that it's there. That's going to make that a higher risk system. And even regardless of what type of likelihood is related to that, you might decide because there's so much at stake if this system were compromised, I want to make sure that this vendor is really doing their part of it. So you might have others where it's your tool for scheduling calendar or meetings on your calendar where there's some integration with things. Maybe it's low risk. Do you need to do quite as much with that vendor? Maybe not. So when you look at your vendors, take that same kind of idea of understanding what factors attribute to the impact and then the likelihood with them as well to determine how deep you want to go in their assessment as well.
Yeah, I think that's an important part because ultimately, somebody has to make a decision on what good looked like, and if you're in a regulatory position, it won't be your opinion that matters. It'll be New York, or it'll be Washington State, or California, or Colorado. Whoever. It might even be the federal government. Somebody else at some point is going to tell you if you did a good enough job, and we've seen evidence of that, as they start to lean in on their compliance. You've told the story of First American Title a couple of times, where at the end of the day, quality mattered.
Yeah, and to dig deeper into that, this was one of the first lawsuits that came out of New York's cyber rule. And First American Title Insurance, um, they're a large organization and they'd had a pretty major breach. That caused New York to take a deeper look at what they were doing. They saw they were doing a risk assessment. Somebody had delegated that down to a lower level employee. I believe that there were some questions about the qualifications of that person that conducted it. But what really happened here is even though they did what the law said and they did a risk assessment, they didn't do a very good job. And they particularly did not do a very good job on leadership holding up what came out of that risk assessment and taking action on things. And so that really was what they saw led to the breach happening. They were a little careless with things, even though they went through the motions. And so what I think is unique about this story and what's important to watch, and I'm sure they were used as an example because it was the very first lawsuit out of New York, they basically were saying quality is an important part of this. We're not just saying do a risk assessment, we're saying do a good one and make sure that whatever you do after this informs the rest of your decisions. And so this is one where, again, leadership didn't delegate properly. They weren't taking responsibility for it, and then they just didn't follow through with things. So I think it's a great example of what these legislators are looking for and what can happen if you're shown to be neglectful in the way that you handle these things.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think our audience now falls into one of two categories. Either they got scared and left and they're no longer here, or they understand that there's real value in doing this thing, and they want to do it right and they want to do it well. So we got some options. You can do it yourself. You can hire a third party. You got some options. Let's kind of pick those things off.
And by the way, the laws don't say exactly how to get the risk assessment done. They just say to do it.
No, they just say do it. But they also say be qualified. So
It's
I'm
true.
going to say what that means. So let's start with option number one. I'm just gonna do this myself. I'm gonna get started. I mean, the pro is that it's cheaper that way. But let's talk about the cons. What are the cons in just struggling, tightening the bootstraps and getting it done? What does that look like?
Yeah, it's a lot of work. I mean, you're still going to have to go through and understand all of your inventory and the aspects related to the likelihood and impact there. And so if you haven't done that, and you don't understand really what attributes to those factors, you could be in a tough spot figuring out really how to do this. And so you might spend a little extra time, even, especially the first time going around through this, just figuring out what you're doing. And again, to Jason's point, it does say in those laws that you do have to have the right qualifications if you're going to do these things. And so it's going to be important to make sure that you're doing this in a way that, again, if somebody else looked at your work, they're able to see that you had a correct process with this, that you did follow a framework, that you didn't reinvent the wheel, that you understood what you were doing. But if you're only working in your own business, you might not have some of the outside perspective to really understand those things, and you're really just isolated to what you've seen. There's only one environment you've been in. And so, maybe that's not always the case, but you're just going to have a little bit more of a narrow view with it.
Yeah, that's the largest con I see from insurance agencies who have competent and qualified internal IT staff. I mean, they've got Security Plus designations. They've got 10, 15 years under their belt. I mean, these are not newbies that we're talking about here. But there's a lack of objectivity. Um, it's not a bad thing. It's just the nature of, I manage one network. I manage it well, as far as I know. I haven't had any kind of compromises that I know of, and I've been doing it this way for 15, 20 years. I'm going to keep doing it this way 20 years, like kind of a one-trick pony. Although, all the backstory kind of supports why I do what I do and how I do it. I I don't have any risks that I'm aware of. If I've thought about it, I've done a good job of implementing it. That's to me that's the greatest risk of
Yeah.
doing it yourself without that second set of eyes, without really stress testing what your current state is or what you think it is.
And that's a good point too. And something that we didn't list in here is the bias that you can have inadvertently, and sometimes it just might depend on the individuals involved. If you think about maybe an overconfident IT person that, feels like they did a good job, or that if they
Never met
do,
one of those.
or if they do a risk assessment, oh, this might make me look bad because maybe there's some things we're not proud of here. It's important to get out because then you can make the right decisions now. So you have to kind of accept what you have, but that bias might cause people to hide some of that stuff. The other side of it is during the executive summary, you might have some results in here that maybe because your job feels in jeopardy with this, you're afraid to tell your executives that some of the decisions they made around certain things are causing a greater risk and we need to change. And so you might not feel confident to bring that up to them and to really confront that. When sometimes when you have a third party, it might be a little easier for them to be the bad guy there and say, hey, maybe we should have the producers also use MFA. So things like that can really be kind of hidden in these biases that happen in our culture, and we don't want that to creep into a risk assessment because we really want a clear picture.
That's one thing I think we don't talk about enough is the culture of this stuff. There's everybody's afraid to get it wrong, and everybody's afraid to admit that they don't necessarily know all of the things or have all of the answers, and that's kind of something just in general that we need to kind of focus on and do better at. When someone clicks on an email or they open a link or they get fooled into giving out an MFA thing. I mean, that's why we do this. It's nobody's fault. We're humans. We're in fact we make mistakes, and there's a lot of this that kind of gets hidden. Like we don't want to admit that we weren't perfect, and I think
Mm.
that's an important thing to mention. It didn't land in the slide deck anywhere,
No.
but I think that's pretty important.
Well, you want to have a mindset of, I don't know what I don't know. Some of the best people that have done this kind of stuff that I've worked with came to us with that understanding. They want to learn that side that they don't know. You don't want to be blindsided by this stuff. That's the goal of it. You want to be able to make some decisions, but also be able to prepare for the things that could happen and not be surprised. And so that's the goal of this, is try to get your best effort of understanding what could happen so you're not blindsided.
Let's talk about the elephant in the room. Can I just ask ChatGPT? Like at this point, is it not good enough? Can I just put some words in there and can't that serve as my expert? in my second set of eyes?
You know, it's tough, and we debated even asking this question or planting that seed. I would highly recommend not going that route. There are AI tools that could help with some of this stuff. They might be able to help facilitate the process, but I'd be very cautious because again, this goes back to your ability to show that you did a good job with this. And if you're using AI as your delegate to go do this stuff, well, is that really qualified? And we've seen ChatGPT make up stuff. We've seen it get confused about information. Some of the things that it searches for across the web to get information to answer your questions might be coming from unapproved sources or incorrect information as well. So there's a lot of risk with doing that. I like to use it in ways to say, am I missing anything? Is there anything I should be thinking about here? So I think there's some ways where maybe, again, it can facilitate stuff, but I would not necessarily trust ChatGPT to complete a risk assessment for you or to guide you through one.
Yeah, I like to use it as a place to find statistics and probability when I'm thinking through likelihood and impact. I'll ask ChatGPT or Copilot, help me quantify this thing. Here's what I am as a business, and here's how I do it. Um, Look out into the world and find me some industry specifics and help me put this thing into perspective. I also like to use perplexity.ai for that because it does a very good job of citing resources. So I know that I'm, getting legitimate intel and not just something that it made up in thin air. Um, so yeah, like you, I think there's a place in the world for ChatGPT, and I think it can be an effective tool in the toolbox. Um, certainly not a wholesale replacement, I don't think. So let's say we're not going to do it ourselves. Um, we're going to get a third party to help. Um, what does that look like? Pros and cons.
Yeah, so it's really the opposite of what we were just talking about. You know, when now you might have more cost associated with it because you bring in a third party. You're of course getting the right kind of experience though, and it's a lot cheaper than necessarily hiring an internal cybersecurity person. But you're still going to have to do a lot of stuff. You're still involved in communicating with them. You're still part of the plan. So you're not getting away from the work, and the cost is actually going to bring a lot of benefits because now you have somebody coming in, as we talked about before, they're not biased. Their job is to help you really understand your risks, and they're helping you communicate it to executives. That's what they're there for. They're not there to make enemies with IT or tell somebody they did their job wrong. They're there to help you assess this. And so I think you bring in somebody that can bring in that perspective. Plus, they've probably seen a lot of different environments. They might do 100 of these a year. So they've seen a lot of different organizations. They see what other people are doing. They have a pulse on what's happening with different attacks out there, and they're going to bring a different perspective. And they're probably going to help you speed up things a little bit because now they have a formal process for all of this, including a lot more clear reporting ability and all of the content that they build around it that's going to help you understand this in the end. So it's going to look more buttoned up. It's going to look more professional in a lot of cases because they've probably honed that in as they go. And if you get into a tough spot here after you've found some of these things and they tell you, okay, here's what you need to go do, they might even have different resources that can help you take it the rest of the way, or at least just help educate you the rest of the way around it. So it's going to help, again, with that conversation after the risk assessment's done, as far as where do we go from here.
Yep, I like it. And you're right, there's not an easy button. You do it yourself, you hire a third party, you contract the whole thing out. There's no easy button. You're still spending time and treasure. Um, the good news is, if you do it right and you do it well, and you add those third parties in, for every hour you spend on this, you're going to get a much better return on investment, in my opinion, because you've got peers in the room, you've got experience in the room. They're throwing ideas. Hey, did you think about this? Here's the concern with that. What does that look like? My my favorite part of risk assessments really is that conversation and that intersection of where the IT meets the executive desk, and we really drill down on what access looks like, what roles, how do we separate that, how do we protect it. That's, for me, that's always been the most enjoyable part of the risk assessment, because I feel like we're really working on the business and working on the business needs on behalf of everybody involved. I've always liked that.
when you can kind of be the third party can kind of be that translator, the mediator of the event between IT and
Sometimes
leadership.
referee, yeah,
Yeah.
when it's necessary.
They might need to help communicate what IT is saying they need or what they're doing to executives. So sometimes they can help bridge that gap there and vice versa. One other thing worth noting too on both of these cases, whether you do it yourself or have a third party, if you haven't done a risk assessment before, the first time through all of this is probably going to be the hardest.
Oh
The
yeah.
next year around, as you go through this again, you're really kind of repeating things and updating things, maybe changing your assessment based on new technology that's there. It's going to get a lot easier as you go. So that's why we usually say with that risk pyramid, you're starting usually at that first tier and then you go more up that pyramid as you mature. So it allows you to do that because now you're more thorough, you're more organized. And it's going to get easier and easier.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so where do we get help with all this? We figured out this is a thing we want to do. We got to do it. We're doing it for the right reasons. We're not doing it because New York said so. We're doing this because we care. We've decided that we're not climbing this hill alone. We're gonna bring in a third party. Let's get some help with this thing. Where do we go? Where do we go from there? Kind of falls into two categories. For what we call internal help. We've got, IT, cybersecurity teams, managed service providers. We've got internal operations. We've got leadership. If you've got a third party company that you work with for your IT services, a managed service provider, you might already have all the pieces together to pull this already in your tool stack. It just may be a matter of scheduling the meetings and putting some plans together. Of course, not all IT companies are created equally. A lot of them they stop at that lower end of the pyramid. They won't get involved with business processes. They won't get involved with writing out and helping you understand policies and procedures. So you might need to hire some guns for those little pieces, even if you have an internal IT team or you're working closely with an MSP. That was a lot of what you did in your formal life, Ryan, was that you, for the most part, and we got the 80% here. Now we need to bring in that 20%. What's been your experience being that expert help and that hired gun?
Yeah, well, I mean, I believe that it does help to have an unbiased third party involved in it. If you're working with IT that is, in charge of the environment, they're managing it, and now they're asked to assess their work, I feel like there's always some room for bias. There are ways to account for some of that, and that's not always the case with every company. But by having a third party do this, they really come in from that other perspective, and they're able to really kind of help you that extra level of quality assurance. And so that's where a lot of people liked working with us with this, is because we would bring in that unbiased perspective because we weren't there to replace the MSP. We didn't do the IT work. So we're there to help with your risks and then really understanding it, communicating it to help benefit both parties, the client and their MSP.
Yeah, that's what we've done over the years. We've of course we have the staff and the capability to do this ourselves. We wouldn't really need to go outside, but that that bias is there and it's real, and we've never wanted to give ourselves an excuse or find a way to convince ourselves that a risk is worth accepting when it wasn't. So we've always gone to third party vendors like CompTIA to come in and audit our stuff and look at our processes, and go to peers in the industry that we have relationships with, and really just, we're an open book. Tell us what you like and what you don't like, and then we wait for the punch in the nose. That's worked really well for us, I think. So, next steps. This is where we give out some homework assignments. Sorry, not sorry. Um,
Well, and on these, by the way, some of these will help you be more efficient when you do pull in somebody or if you start this process. So these are things that you could do right now. One of the things that I would advise people to do immediately, if you don't have it already, is start to get an inventory. Uh, Earlier, Jason listed a handful of things. There's actually 6 that I recommend people tracking as part of their risks. First is your hardware, your enterprise assets, so physical technology. Second would be your software, the things that the applications, the technology that you're using on those devices. Next would be your data management inventory. So where is all the data going? What kind of systems, and this is probably going to overlap those first two, but where is all of this going and what kind of data do we need to take extra care with? Next would be your accounts. What kind of user accounts do you have? As an employee of your agency, maybe I have 10 or 20, and sometimes with companies, you might have hundreds of logins out there. So which ones have access to sensitive information? Which ones have strong passwords and MFA in place? If I have an employee leave, how do I make sure that I'm getting rid of all of those access points? And then next would be your third parties that you work with. We talked a little bit about that already. And the sixth one I kind of added more recently because a lot of people are using AI today. I think that's a class of its own of a type of software where you need to think about the types of information that goes into the AI model, how their training model is protected from others out there and other things that they're doing. So you need to understand that it may be a little bit more uniquely because it's a different type of technology today. From there, once you understand your inventory, then you can gather that team, all of the people within your office, the leaders, the operations people, the IT people, whatever that looks like, who needs to be a stakeholder in this. Once you have that assembled, these are things that you can do before you even schedule a risk assessment, but I would do it as you're in the process of doing it. Figure out whether you're going to do it yourself or grab a third party and then start to plan that. So you can be gathering things while you're starting to figure out how you're going to do the risk assessment next.
And that's a pro tip right there.
Yeah.
The better you are, the more prepared. You've got these lists at hand. You don't have to pay a guy like me to build them for you, that's a huge win.
You don't need a consultant sitting on the phone while you generate these lists. You can start building that stuff. And they might ask more questions, but it's going to save a lot of time. Next is
Ton of time.
after you've done the risk assessment. Now, well, actually, sorry, before that, you might start to look at your policy procedures, but I caution people on that because a lot of people, again, want this glowing risk assessment that shows no gaps. Well, it's a point in time assessment. It's going to probably help you address those gaps next. So I would review your policy procedures, button them up a little bit, but don't feel like you need to put exorbitant amount of work into that. Get them cleaned up a little bit so you can start to look at them as you do your assessment. You're probably going to get some priority items outside of it. So let that come out of the risk assessment. Don't let that be the thing that keeps you from doing what's important.
And
When
that
you,
is a good place where ChatGPT can
yeah,
help you as you have those policies and stuff. Sanitize them, make sure there's no non-public information or confidential stuff. But send that paperwork to ChatGPT and it'll tell you what's missing. And it can do the hard work of comparing it to a NIST framework or something like that to know what good looks like and provide you with some really good recommendations.
just make sure you're verifying things that you get out of it.
100%.
The fourth thing I'd suggest here, train your employees on what comes out of this. This is a chance to build your culture around these understandings. Now, you might not want to show everybody the details of your risk assessment, but there are things in that executive summary that might be worth sharing with staff. Here are this is the stuff that could happen if our agency is breached. These are the things that relate to your job. These are the things that we're going to start doing to improve our security and make sure that your job is safe and the clients you work with aren't mad at us. These are things that are going to help our business stay around. So once you help them understand that, that can fold into your security awareness training and be a part of what you tell your staff about the plan ahead. And then, of course, after you're done with all of this stuff, keep in mind a risk assessment is a point in time snapshot of this stuff. That showed what you did today, the day that that report was generated. Tomorrow, there could be new weaknesses that appear in your environment. There could be changes that are happening constantly. So that's where things like the vulnerability scanning, continuous monitoring, and some of these other ways of keeping tabs on changes are really important. So that's where your policy procedures are going to guide you. But it's important to understand that this risk assessment is just that snapshot. You want to make sure that you are assessing risk as you continue throughout the year.
Yep. Rinse and repeat. That is the mode of the day. So how we at Kite Tech can help with these things. We do IT services. Because of our backstory and insurance and our deep awareness of what that looks like, we go a little farther than your standard run-of-the-mill vanilla IT. We do all the things, application support, help desk, stuff like that. But we also do within the security and compliance realms. We do risk assessments. We do understand those NAIC model laws, those regulatory compliance. We've got our nose to the grindstone in those areas. We do help our clients writing those information security policies, talking through those things, security awareness training. This year, we're actually adding some penetration testing. We've done that third party when necessary, but we're bringing that in-house, all those good things. Ryan, I know you've got a lot of stuff that kind of
Yeah.
complements the services that Kite Tech offers.
Yeah, Secure My Agency. Definitely check that out if you're looking for understanding what things you need to do in more topics like we covered today. There are resources that can help you with some of this stuff if you don't have a resource like Kite to go to. Secure My Staff is a newer one that we just launched here this year, where again we have more insurance specific content to help with your training. And then of course, if you do sell cyber and you want help with that, there's ways I can help your producers learn how to talk about the stuff without getting into the technical weeds like we did today. So definitely check out somemorecyber.com if you want help in that area too.
Yeah, that's an important thing, and one of the steps that I think we're both kind of taking on is, as we work with agencies, they've got a ton of customers too, and they may or may not know where to go. So it's kind of easy to um, recommend that somebody buy a cyber liability policy, but number one, how do you sell it? And then number two, what do you do when coalition comes back or travelers comes back and says, no, these guys don't meet the mark?
Or how do you explain those scans they ran?
Yes, or how do you even know what the HTTP 443 situation? What even is that? We've gotten into a lot of those conversations too, helping our agencies help those folks just to kind of get the word out there and get everything done. So that's all I got for the Dog and Pony Show. I'm gonna leave this up and get to some questions we have. Well, we've got just a little bit over time, but that's okay. Start with this question from Mary. Are there any safe AI applications?
Can I take that?
oh,
So
oh yeah, I'm sure we got some strong opinions. Let's
yeah.
wrestle that one to the ground.
So there's no such thing as a truly secure environment. There's always some level of risk because even if you have something where you feel like it's really locked down and the probability of an attack is not very high, and you're still using it to have sensitive information reviewed, or again, there's a component of trust. There's three things. There's confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So sensitive information, the ability to trust what's coming out of things, and then the reliability of that tool. So when you think about AI, in a lot of cases, it's intended to be protected. And the information that you put in there, they don't want that to be accessible to other people. But keep in mind, just like with your technology you use in your office, attackers are out there breaking these things and using it in ways that it's not supposed to be used. And they're breaking past these things that are supposed to keep things contained and protected. So the fact that sensitive information might be in something is enough of a risk to consider that it might be a higher risk than other things. Now, when it comes to AI too, there's a lot of factors that might attribute to the likelihood or probability of it being attacked. Like, for example, if you use ChatGPT, you're asking a lot of sensitive information. Again, maybe you feel comfortable that it's not getting out of there. Well, did you put MFA on your account and could I compromise that and go in and see all the stuff that you told it? So there are ways that these things can be manipulated, and there is always a form of risk with it. So when you ask if they're safe AI tools, there's always a caveat to that. There are a lot of companies out there that are doing things to really protect what goes into these tools and protect their use, but you still have to assess that level of risk with it. So it falls into this risk assessment piece. You need to start to understand those factors, and that's what's going to determine whether you feel it's safe enough to use.
Yeah, I would say there's certainly some safer AI applications. Take ChatGPT, for example. It's got free versions and it's got paid versions. General rule of thumb is if it's a free version, you are the data set. So that's kind of step one is make sure that this is a service that you're paying for. It's got terms and conditions. It's got an end user licensing agreement. It's very clear in terms of how it uses the data that you do share, where it goes. Is it being used to train the model and build other things? Is it not? Is it unique to you? Um, I tend to favor Copilot over ChatGPT for that reason. Um, my email, all of my data is hosted in Microsoft. I've got a really strong working relationship with Microsoft. Therefore, I tend to trust Copilot more. It's a safer bet. There's more at stake, more dollars at stake. And I'm already in that wheelhouse. It already has access to that data. I'm just exposing it in a slightly different way. And that's where that likelihood and impact and stuff comes into play with that risk. But I think there are some generally safe applications. Of course, as you take a step up and you get out of the generative space and you really get into data warehousing and agents and AIs that synthesize and improve your data set, where you've got an agency management system that puts data through API calls into a data warehouse, and now you've got some AI stuff on top of that. Because you're building that with a vendor and you're owning that data, you're building that data warehouse, and you're in your Amazon stack, or you're maybe it's a server in a closet that I hope you don't forget about. Hopefully it's up in Azure or something like that. It does fundamentally change risk and data and what that looks like. So you got to see it through the lens of likelihood and impact. But there are certainly ways to get to a point where you can decide, okay, this is a safe enough bet that I'm going to go forward with it and do some things for sure.
Yeah, and Mary added, Otter for an example. So something that can actually be added to a webinar to capture the conversation. So you have to think, okay, what sensitive information was discussed in this? Now it's in Otter's system. Otter has access to that. Could somebody get access to that? What else was discussed in there? The trust level, am I worried if it mixed up something or maybe didn't transcribe something correctly? That's probably lower risk. If it's not there when I need it, I'm not as worried about that. So I might just be more worried about the sensitive content that we talked about. And maybe I decide, you know what, I have it locked up on MFA. I've done my due diligence to make sure that any confidential information is protected as best as possible by Otter. So I feel comfortable using this and I accept this risk. But it's the ability to go through that system by system again, kind of like we talked about through the assessment process, to make those decisions. And so, Mary, I think what would help you a lot would be to go through something like a risk assessment and understand those tools and to think about the use cases of them and what attributes to their likelihood and impact. And that's going to help you decide, is this a risk worth taking? Some of these things you have to watch for, because as it makes us more efficient, we usually give up a little security to do that. So, we're getting benefits of what Otter can do by capturing the meeting, but is the risk worth it? It might be.
Yeah, I was in a meeting just the other day with an industry representative, and we were talking about some pretty confidential things, and they enacted a policy that, so we all get into the room, about 23 of us, and they said, okay, no offense, guys, but we're kicking all the note takers out of the room except ours, all your little AI agents. It's not that we don't trust them. They're probably fine tools, but we don't know what you're doing with that data on the other side. So because we can't guarantee confidentiality through and through the stack, we just have to kick them all out of the room. We'll use ours because we're hosting the meeting, and we'll share the data that it provides in a secure method. But all your note takers gotta sit at the door. Sorry. And I thought that was a pretty, it hurt my feelings because my note taker got kicked out. But once I got over it, I thought that was a pretty good answer to the problem of these AIs and these note takers. I liked it. I respected that and I appreciated it. Okay.
I think
So I got one more question here. It says we did a risk assessment and it uncovered some things that the IT company said it was going to cost a ton to fix. It wasn't in the budget. Any suggestions on what to do in that situation? And I think that happens a lot as you get into these things and you come out with a honey-do list that's got some real dollars associated with it that you didn't plan for.
It might be hard for a lot of offices with some of this. I see a lot of cases where cybersecurity is under budgeted. And it's because a lot of times the people deciding on the budget don't necessarily know what goes into it. Or if they haven't done a risk assessment to begin with, well, you're again, you're planning without understanding where you're at today. And so and the other side of this too is I'll see a lot of times people will allocate cybersecurity as a subset of your IT budget, which again, when we look at that risk pyramid, cybersecurity and compliance, this is beyond IT. This is related, but it's not just IT. So I think it's hard to say this is going to come out of IT's budget. And a lot of offices, IT's under budgeted already, and now you're taking away some important pieces for them. And so you might not be able to afford to do some of those things that come out of this, but now you have something that you can look at and say, here are my priorities, and I can make decisions now based on those. So it will help me decide which things I can't afford to do and which things I need to put off later, or maybe I got to figure something out. And so when you do this, it's going to help you have that conversation better, and it's going to help you plan better for the next year, because now next time budgeting comes around, you're going to have a better understanding of these gaps that are there because you still have them and you know they're going to show up in next year's risk assessment. So it's going to help be part of, again, that maturity that you want to build into your organization.
Yeah, and I think the fundamental suggestion, um, if you find yourself in that situation, don't do nothing. Um, you still have to do something. Step one being understanding that risk, likelihood, probability, and hitting an area of priority. So you know what to start with. And I think you do need to start. And even if you don't land on a perfect solution, maybe there's an option for, doing it a certain way that costs a bit more than we're willing to pay right now, but there's a lower tiered option, or maybe something that takes a little bit more manual effort. Um, I would choose that secondary option over nothing, because again, New York's going to come in and they're going to give you their opinion on what you did and how you did it. And um, doing something, or doing the best that you can is always a more defensible position than doing nothing and saying, yeah, I just couldn't afford to look at it this year, I'm going to do it next year. You're
And I would
going to have
document
to
those
justify
decisions
that.
too. If you decided to accept a risk, again, understanding, because you've gone through a risk assessment, you can say you understand the risk that you're accepting and what it could lead to, but you might be able to justify now why you've accepted that. And documenting that's going to be an important part of it. You're going to want to show accountability for everything that's in that risk assessment. Items that you're going to reduce or manage, and then items that you're going to accept, you want to show that you're doing something maybe to mitigate it or to the best of your ability are. And so again, that goes back to just being able to show a thorough plan with everything.
Yeah, absolutely. And in a lot of cases, a lot of agencies are putting AI in that lens. Is like they just don't feel like they're ready to undertake the risk. So their answer is, we're not allowing AI. We're not doing anything. Um, and of course, everybody's got some strong opinions on that. We talk about AI a lot, and we really encourage agencies to be doing something with it, not nothing. But I do see a lot of agencies saying, yeah, we just don't trust the process yet. We're not ready to unpack it. So the answer is going to be no. Um, sometimes that is the best answer. If it's the one you can defend and swear on a stack of Bibles that we really did a good job, we thought about it, we thought long and hard about it, and then we said no. um, Ultimately, yeah, if you can defend it, it's the right answer. Okay. I think that about does it. Any closing thoughts? Anything we need to think about? Anything we didn't cover? Rachel, how we do? Do we still have jobs?
I think you both still have jobs. I think that's very clear. I think there's a lot of stuff that people took away today. So thank you both so much for this presentation today. And thank you everyone for joining us today. If you have any follow-up questions or want to explore more about our services or RLS's services, feel free to reach out to Kite Tech here or on the with the contact information on the screen here, or RLS's consulting. RLS Consulting is information on the screen as well. If you're already a Kite Tech client and have questions, be sure to reach out to your client experience manager. And before you go, please take a moment to complete the quick survey that's about to pop up. Your feedback is always helpful for us to make our webinars even more valuable to you. So don't worry if you missed anything. We'll be sending out the recording for this in just a few days. And thank you again for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Ryan.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Thanks for having me, guys.